Coming up today, 2 days and a double whammy of Japanese claims to Korea's Dokdo Island. This time, Tokyo's so-called diplomatic blue paper falsely states Dokdo is part of Japan's territory. South Korean businessmen with operations at the inter-Korean Kaesong industrial complex are meeting with North Korean officials as they look to defuse a brewing crisis over workers' wages. Plus, Samsung Electronics posts first quarter profits of $5.4 billion, beating market expectations. It'll hope to kick on with the upcoming global release of its latest smartphone, the Galaxy S6. These stories and more coming right up. Hello, it's noon on Tuesday, the 7th of April. You're tuned in to our midday newscast here on Arirang TV. Thanks ever so much for joining us. I'm Mark Broom. Our top story this afternoon. It was a move that was expected, but one that has already drawn fury from the Korean government. Japan has made fresh territorial claims to Korea's easternmost Dokdo Island in its annual diplomatic paper. This as the dust has barely settled on Tokyo's decision to approve history textbooks, falsely claiming Dokdo as Japanese territory. Hwang Sung-hee starts us off.
Just a day after approving new school textbooks stating Korea's Dokdo Island as its territory, Japan has repeated the claim in its yearly diplomatic guide. The so-called diplomatic blue paper, presented by Japanese Foreign Minister Fumio Kishida at a cabinet meeting on Tuesday, says Dokdo is clearly Japan's sovereign territory in terms of history and international law. The diplomatic paper will be published in English for the first time in 9 years, raising concerns Tokyo is trying to take the issue to the international stage. The move is raising extra concerns as it comes just a day after Japan approved a batch of new middle school textbooks with stronger claims over Dokdo. The number of textbooks stating Dokdo as being illegally occupied by Korea now stands at 13, triple the number just 4 years ago. Tokyo's unjustified claims over Dokdo, known as Takeshima in Japanese, have been one of the thorniest issues between the two neighbors. To protest the latest revisions, Seoul's foreign ministry on Monday summoned Japanese ambassador to Korea Korobetsho and called for Tokyo's sincerity in time for the 50th anniversary of the normalization of their diplomatic ties.
We urge Japan to make efforts to improve bilateral ties with sincerity based on the spirits of apologies made by its previous administrations on this landmark year.
As Japan steps up its territorial claims, experts say Korea must strengthen measures to oversee all events involving Dokdo. They also point out the need to set long-term policy goals for defending the group of islets. Hwang Sung-hee, Arirang News.
Meanwhile, some of those recently approved school textbooks by Japan are raising more eyebrows in Korea over their historical description of Japan's colonial aggressions. Seoul-based Yonhap news agency reports that while most of the textbooks contain an objective depiction of history, some books by right-wing publishers contain some rather controversial descriptions that could be interpreted as glorifying Japan's invasion of Korea and its subsequent colonial rule. The report cited one textbook in particular which compared the Korean population, schools and farmland from 1911 and 1936, which could be viewed as an attempt to show that imperialist Japanese rule contributed to Korea's modernization. However, the report did stress that there were also textbooks that sharply criticized Japan's colonization. Korea and Japan have agreed to resume a long-suspended security dialogue later this month to discuss the current situation on the Korean Peninsula and other East Asian regions. Japan's Kyodo news agency reported on Monday that senior defense and foreign affairs officials from the two countries are going to meet in Seoul next Tuesday. During the so-called 2+2 meeting, Japan plans to explain the revised US-Japan defense guideline to Korea. The two sides are also expected to share insights on North Korea's nuclear and missile programs. The talks have been suspended since the last meeting all the way back in late 2009 due to strained bilateral relations over history-related issues. Now, 17 South Korean business executives with factories at the Inter-Korean Kaesong Industrial Complex are currently meeting there in an attempt to make some progress on the standoff over wages. In February, Pyongyang declared a unilateral wage hike for North Korean workers at the complex. South Korea refused to give in to the demand, but the North has ignored repeated calls for bilateral consultations. We have our Kim Hyun-bin standing by at the Inter-Korean Transit Office in Paju. Hyun-bin, what's the latest?
Hi there, Mark. Several South Korean executives from the Kaesong Industrial District Management Committee went into the complex in North Korea less than 3 hours ago. Now they're holding an emergency meeting with members of the Kaesong Operating Committee. Now here's what a committee representative had to say.
This wage hike is neither a big issue nor an unreasonable request. The problem lies with inter-Korean relations. They're at their worst with no government-level dialogue. But the wage hike is a global issue every year, so it is not considered a huge problem.
So, Hyun-bin, it sounds like the big problem is the lack of dialogue, not the wage hike itself. How is Pyongyang expected to respond to this meeting?
Yeah, that's right. As of now, there's no telling what Pyongyang's response will be or if they will even respond. Now, so far, the North has ignored the South's call for government-level dialogue or any discussions for that matter. Now, we do have to keep in mind that the April 10th payday for North Korean workers is just a few days away, so the pressure is mounting. Now, that's all I have for now. I'll bring more updates as the day unfolds.
Thank you very much, Hyun-bin. Now, a former U.S. nuclear negotiator says the recently inked Iranian nuclear framework deal can serve as a good example for North Korea in persuading the regime to come back to the stalled multilateral talks on its denuclearization. However, doubts clearly remain as Pyongyang has yet to show any willingness to change its attitude. Our Son Jung-in has more.
Speaking at Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies on Monday, Christopher Hill said recent progress on the Iranian nuclear deal could act as an inducer to persuade North Korea to return to the long-stalled six-party talks on its nuclear program. However, Hill, who was head of the U.S. delegation to the six-party talks in the mid-2000s, said that in order for it to happen, Pyongyang must first change its attitude and show sincerity towards denuclearization. Hill was quick to add that the Kim Jong-un regime has yet to make such a move. The former diplomat, who also served as U.S. ambassador to South Korea, said the North wants the world to recognize it as a nuclear power, but such a shift should never be allowed to happen. He underscored that Pyongyang must return to the negotiating table based on the conditions outlined in an agreement signed with the other party members in 2005. Hill also contended Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's recent remarks in which he said that under the New Deal, Iran would eventually end up developing a nuclear bomb, repeating the same path as North Korea. Hill also commented on the ongoing debate over the potential deployment to South Korean soil of a controversial U.S. missile defense system. He said it's an appropriate time for Washington and Seoul to be talking about the issue since the system, called Terminal High Altitude Area Defense, or THAAD for short, would protect South Korea against the North's nuclear threats. Son Jung-in, Arirang News.
U.S. Secretary of Defense Ashton Carter says the goal of his trip to South Korea this week is to reinforce deterrence against North Korea. Speaking in the U.S. on Monday local time, right before his scheduled visit to South Korea and Japan, Carter said he will be looking to improve capabilities to counteract an increasingly dangerous and provocative North Korea. He added Washington is looking to build an information sharing agreement with South Korea and Japan to collectively respond to crises in the region. Now, Carter will meet with South Korean Defense Minister Han Min-gu on Friday. This will be his first trip to Seoul since becoming U.S. Defense Secretary in February. Revisions to Korea's tax law came into effect last year and promptly upset many middle-income earners who ended up paying more than they had expected. Now, the government says it's working on a bill to issue rebates for the extra amounts those taxpayers had to fork out. Our Shin Se-min reports.
Korea's Ministry of Strategy and Finance says it will refund overpayments made by some middle-income earners in 2014. The 2013 tax revisions were expected to increase taxes for high-income earners and anyone who made less than 55 million won, or a little over $50,000 would pay less or the same as previous years. But 15% of middle-income earners did actually face a heavier tax burden following the revision. And for that particular group, the government has pledged to improve the tax policy. One change would expand the tax deduction for households with more than 3 children. However, on Tuesday, the ministry maintained that overall, the revised tax law did not put an additional burden on taxpayers.
The Korea Federation of Taxpayers says the revised law has bombarded taxpayers with a heavier burden. But it's not just the revised law, but increased taxes on higher earners that have also played into effect.
Still, many salaried workers, most of them middle-income earners, criticize the government's new tax policy for making their lives more difficult. The issue even forced Finance Minister Choi Kyung-hwan to make a public apology in January. The ministry added that the follow-up changes to the 2013 revised tax code will be applied after parliamentary approval later this month, issuing refunds to some 5.4 million Koreans. Shin Se-min, Arirang News.
Now, on the political front, the National Assembly kicks off its month-long extraordinary session on this Tuesday, and lawmakers are facing an extraordinary slate of issues, from reforming debt-ridden pension plans for public servants to redistricting election constituencies to passing piled-up bills. For example, a bill that would make surveillance cameras at childcare services mandatory. However, rival parties are expected to clash over a number of issues, such as implementing ordinances for the special law on the Seoul-ho ferry disaster, this against the backdrop of the accident's one-year anniversary next week. The Assembly will also proceed with interpellation sessions for 4 days next week. Now, after a 2014 to forget, Samsung Electronics says it expects earnings in the first 3 months of this year to beat analysts' forecasts, in a much-needed sign of a possible turnaround for the beleaguered Korean firm. Adding to optimism is better-than-expected pre-orders for Samsung's new smartphone, the Galaxy S6, and new demand for its microchips. Song Ji-son reports.
Samsung Electronics' first quarter figures show the Korean tech giant did better in terms of quality than it did in quantity. Samsung generally fared better than expectations, despite seasonal factors and slowing demand in the global market. Samsung sales for the first 3 months of the year stood at $43 billion, down 11% from last year. Profits were also down 30% during the same period, standing at $5.4 billion. While sales fell slightly short of market expectations, profits actually outstripped the market consensus, continuing its recovery, gaining 12% from the fourth quarter of last year. The smartphone maker's profitability also bounced back to double figures, settling at over 12.5%. Rewind just 2 quarters and this figure was at a mere 8% when Samsung logged its lowest earnings figures in 3 years. While the guidance figure released on Tuesday does not break down performance by sector, market analysts assume Samsung generated $3 billion in profits from its semiconductor arm and $2 billion from its mobile sector. With some analysts calling Samsung's first quarter figures an earnings surprise, there are expectations that second quarter profits could exceed $7 billion, with Samsung's latest Galaxy S6 smartphone model set to go on global release on Friday. Song Ji-son, Arirang News.
Fresh worries for the export-driven Korean economy as latest data shows the country's exports to China dropped by 1.5% in the first quarter, with China focusing inwardly and the initial FTA between Korea and China expected to take some time to bear fruit. Storm clouds could be brewing on the horizon. Kwon So-ah reports.
Korea, highly dependent on exports, and especially those to China, is feeling the effects of China's slowing economy. Seoul's Commerce Ministry and the Korea International Trade Association said Tuesday that shipments to China in the January to March period have fallen to around $34 billion. That's 1.5% lower than the same period last year. This comes as there is less demand for imported goods in China, as consumers there are turning to cheaper, made-in-China products.
China's economic policies are now more focused on the domestic market, so Korea could be facing a tough time unless the Korean government makes its export policies more flexible.
The decline comes despite earlier projections that provisional agreements within the Korea-China Free Trade Pact would have a positive impact in Korea's export market. But as China's sluggish growth has affected Korea more than expected, analysts say that even when ratified, the FTA will not be enough to boost exports in the near future. This as the process of lifting tariffs of over 90% of all traded goods will be done over a period of several years. 권소아, Arirang News.
Well, that's all the news we have for now. I'm Mark Broom. Have a great day, and thanks as always for watching us. And we hope to see you at the same time tomorrow. Goodbye.